Loudness Wars. Now, Loudness Wars, what are they? Why is there Loudness Wars? And it originally occurred on vinyl as, like I said before, as mastering began, it was just taking the final mix, and the mastering engineer was responsible for putting it onto the record. And with the record, you've got to make sure that there's no phase issues, because if there is, then the needle can actually bounce out of the record and stuff like that. And so they had to make sure that the levels weren't too hot, or else you could actually cut a hole through the record, things like that, that the mastering engineer was responsible of. Now, as they did this, they realized, well, maybe I can add a little bit of EQ on this to make the bass sound a little better. And then they started adding limiting and stuff like that. And then it was, oh, their records are louder than everybody else's. So everybody else started to add the same thing. They made it a little louder than the first guy. And then the first guy takes and limits it a little bit more. And so the same thing has occurred for years and years. And it's all basically competition. So whichever one is louder is going to be better, supposedly. And you know, when people listen to it, they will pick the louder of the two if they're testing between two different sources. And so that's the kind of idea behind this. But it's gotten out of control, and mastering engineers don't want to make it so loud because it just doesn't sound as good. There's a lot of things that happen when you're adding all that compression and limiting, and when we're turning down those peaks, we're actually distorting some of those, and that actually wears at your ear, and it makes your ears tired. And so if you listen to an album that has been really crushed and smashed with limiting and has slight amounts of distortion on there, you listen to the album, and when you're done, you're tired, your ears are tired, you don't want to listen anymore. But if you listen to something that's been mastered nicely and is maybe a little louder, but there's not that distortion there, then you can listen to album after album, and your ears aren't going to get tired and such. That distortion just kind of wears at you. So the conclusions to all of this are that louder is not always better. Sometimes it's just louder. And heavily limited mixes fatigue the listener's ear and cause them to stop listening sooner. So it kind of turns around on you. And super limiting doesn't make it any better for radio, which is a huge misconception. It actually makes it worse. And this is because radio limits all songs so that there are no noticeable differences between song levels. And so it's basically having old songs that aren't as loud and the new songs that are really loud. And so they've got to put a limiter on the radio station so that they sound the same. So what happens? The old sounds sound louder and sound a little better, and the new sounds just end up getting turned down because they're already maxed out. And so now when they add another limiter on it, it's just going to make them softer so they even out with everything else. And it actually ends up sounding worse because there's another limiter onto what's already been super limited. And the solutions are that you should master to where it sounds good. Don't just make it loud. Maybe a little louder, but don't get to that point of the distortion and such. And refuse to compete in this war. Your listeners are going to love you for it. And then finally, older, more established artists, which have more of a say about their music, do not usually overcompress their masters. And often their music is just as popular, or even more so, than the new artists. And really, it's not necessarily the artist, it's not necessarily the mastering engineers, it is the record labels and then smaller indie labels that are trying to compete with those bigger record labels. People that aren't actually musicians, that are just basically business people that are coming in there and saying, we need this louder than everybody else. And they don't look at the big picture about what it's going to be like on the radio and things like that. So let's take a listen to real quick what this super limiting sounds like. So here's our song. And let's take and pump it up. You hear that distortion? This is what happens when we go through multiple layers of limiting and such. And we could even more emulate it by putting multiple L1 limiters on this. Sometimes it's actually really funny when the climactic moment of the song comes. It's been, there's maybe an acoustic guitar and the vocalist, and that's really loud, and then the whole band comes back in, and the limiter actually crunches down on it so hard that that section sounds softer than everything else, and it just kind of destroys the huge moment of the song because those dynamics are gone. So try to avoid giving in to these loudness wars. Try not to over-limit or super compress your audio, and it'll sound better, and your listeners will love you for it.